Our two speakers today are both in the UK, joining us from London and Norwich respectively, and I'll just give you a brief introduction to them. So Rebecca Salter is the president of the Royal Academy of Arts with a long engagement with Japan, and she spent 6 years living and studying in Japan at a time when it probably wasn't that common for foreigners to be there. So she's a very early discoverer of Japan. She's been a member of the Royal Academy of Arts since 2014 and has risen in 2019 to be its first female president. And then our second speaker is Dr. Sadamura Koto, and she is the curator of this Kawanabe Kyōsai exhibition. She specializes in Japanese art of the late 19th century. She is at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures and also attached to the British Museum. And then finally, I'll just show you the timeline. We're probably going to have to wrap this up pretty much on time at 1 o'clock. So do get your questions in early, otherwise you might not get them in at all. Right, and so on that note, I'll pass over to Rebecca Salter, our first speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be joined by so many people from all over the world. So the Royal Academy in Japan do have a surprisingly long and sort of intertwined history. 1842 is not an eventful year that I particularly remember from my school history lessons, but within the relationship between the Royal Academy and Japan, it's a very significant year. On the southern island of Kyushu in 1842 in Saga City, Hyakutake Kaneyuki was born as the second son of a samurai. And in December of that year, in Shoreditch in London, William Anderson was born. And both these men showed talents in many fields, including as artists, but most importantly for us, or for me, they were both linked to the Royal Academy and developed a passion for each other's countries and culture. Hyakutake, partly because of his elevated social status, was chosen to travel as a student with the Iwakura mission, and he arrived in Liverpool in 1872. And after reading economics at Oxford University, he became a pupil of the Newcastle-born landscape painter Thomas Miles Richardson Jr. And in 1876, Hyakutake became the first Japanese artist to exhibit in the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition with a landscape work. Sadly, we have no images, so we don't know what it looked like, titled View Near Yokohama, Japan. And it is credited in the catalogue, but unfortunately his name, unsurprisingly, is misspelled. And while Hyakutake was studying in London from 1873 to 1880, William Anderson was living in Tokyo. And he'd studied art at Lambeth School of Art, but decided to follow his other interest of medicine. And he was invited to be the professor of anatomy and surgery at the Imperial Naval College in Tokyo. And he learned to speak Japanese and built a very impressive collection of Japanese art, which of course later entered the British Museum. And this is where the Royal Academy comes in. On his return to England, he was appointed the Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy Schools from 1891 to 1900. But even before Anderson's appointment, the first Japanese student had arrived, the architect Tatsuno Kingo, because in those days, the Royal Academy Schools also used to teach architecture, which sadly we no longer do. And he was accepted as a probationer, which was, the clues in the name, a sort of an initial year before you would enter the school properly. He did actually only stay for 1 year and went back to Japan. And he was, before he came to the UK, he was a graduate of the Imperial University in Tokyo, where he'd been taught by the British architect Josiah Condor, and that is a name which I know will come up later, I'm sure. And while in London, he took various courses before returning to Japan, where he rapidly became the foremost Western style architect responsible for such major buildings which still survive today as the Bank of Japan, Tokyo Station, and Nara Hotel. But the first Japanese student to enter the schools properly and actually stay for the full number of years was the painter Ishibashi Kazunori, who, another coincidence, was born in the year, so in 1876, so in the year that Hyakutake's work was first exhibited at the Royal Academy. So he was in the schools from 1905 to 1910. And we have a record of him arriving, signing the register. And we also have in our archive a wonderful photograph of him. And they're all dressed up with sort of bow ties and sort of evening dress, I think, standing in our West courtyard with his fellow students. The women have all got hats on. He married a British wife and he built up a substantial career, which included 2 major commissions in London, the ceiling in a very grand J.P. Morgan house in Wembley, and 37 panels for the medical students' dining hall at the London Hospital. Sadly, none of these works survive. But I don't think he necessarily had a very easy time of it. He used to joke, apparently, that his name means Stone Bridge, but he was stony broke. But he did exhibit 13 times in the summer exhibition between 1908 and 1927, and he continued to send work even after he'd returned to Japan. And our connections with Japan continue. So the Japanese print had been instrumental in opening Western artists' eyes to the sophistication of Japanese art. But of course, very few, if no artists had had the opportunity to go in person. 2 academicians, after the major restoration, so 2 academicians travelled to Japan, so Alfred East in 1889 and Alfred Parsons from 1892 to 94. And Alfred Parsons, who was also very interested in garden design, has left very valuable notes and published an illustrated book, Notes in Japan. And it gives us a very interesting insight into a country in transition from a feudal to a modern society. And again, another neat coincidence, both Alfred Parsons and Ishibashi exhibited in the 1908 summer exhibition. And then there's a bit of a leap until one of my predecessors, President Sir Hugh Casson. He was president when the Great Japan Exhibition was held in 1981 to 1982. And he traveled to Japan at least once, I think, and published a book of his travels with sketches. So those are the people, but what we're talking about today is the latest exhibition in a long line of exhibitions. I mean, probably Japan has been exhibited more frequently in, I don't know statistics on this, but perhaps as frequently as Italy in our exhibition program. So the beginning of the interest in exhibiting Japanese art at the Royal Academy actually began with an exhibition of Chinese art in 1935. The date is significant here because it was mired in all sorts of political difficulties. And initially, it looked as if we wouldn't be able to borrow significant works from Japan, but at the very last minute, it did become possible. And this was one of the most successful exhibitions we've ever held, and is probably the most researched exhibition, actually, by various scholars. So having seen the success of that exhibition, there was a move to hold an equivalent exhibition focused on Japan, and it was penciled in for 1939/1940. So for very obvious reasons, it didn't happen. And then there was this long hiatus until under Hugh Casson, we had the extraordinary Great Japan Exhibition, which lasted 6 months, which was again extraordinary because most of our exhibitions last 3 months, and was hugely popular. And that really, I think, put the link between the Royal Academy and Japan on the map. And since then, we've had an exhibition of Hokusai, Hiroshige, Kuniyoshi, and now the latest is Kyosai, who, of course, as a small child artist, did study with Kuniyoshi. So there is a link there, which I know Sadamura-san is going to tell us much more about. And one final link with Japan and the Royal Academy is that I think I can say that I'm the first Japanese-speaking president of the Royal Academy. So, and I'm determined to keep the links with Japan as close as I possibly can. So I'd now like to hand over to Sadamura-san to hear more about Kyosai in the UK.
Thank you, Rebecca. Let me share the screen. Okay. On the occasion of the exhibition Kyosai, the Israel Goldman Collection at the Royal Academy of Arts, for the next half an hour, I will discuss Kyosai's connection to Britain. To provide some background, I will first give a brief introduction about the artist Kawanabe Kyōsai. Then I'd like to mention a little bit about Britain's relationship with Japan in Kyosai's time. In the second part, I will talk about Kyosai's interest in the West and in Western art and his personal British connections. The last part of the talk touches upon the general interest in Japanese arts and culture in late 19th and early 20th century Britain, and I will discuss the reception and appreciation of Kyosai in Britain. The images of Kyosai's works I'm going to use in this presentation are from the Israel Goldman Collection, unless otherwise specified. Kyosai was born in Koga in 1831 and grew up in Edo, present-day Tokyo, during the last phase of the Tokugawa shogunate. This hereditary military government had lasted for nearly 230 years at that point. Kyosai's first artistic training when he was 6 years old was with the popular ukiyo-e artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi. As Rebecca mentioned, Kuniyoshi's dynamic and exciting woodblock prints were shown at the RA in 2009. Ukiyo-e dealt with topical and fashionable subjects, and it was understood as the art form of townspeople's class. Kyosai studied with Kuniyoshi only for a few years, and around the age 9, his parents moved him to a different studio to study with a Kano School teacher. Kano School was the official painters' school of the Tokugawa shogunate, and Kano artists served the government and the ruling samurai class. Their typical painting subjects were of a timeless nature, such as Chinese and Japanese classics, legends, myth, and historical figures, Buddhist and Taoist images, and auspicious subjects. And in 1849, Kyosai completed the academic Kano School training in 9 years, when it normally took about 11 to 12 years. And he became proficient in traditional ink techniques and complex coloring methods. He also acquired experience in larger compositions to paint on sliding doors and temple ceiling panels, for example. In the 1850s, with the severe decline in the Tokugawa government's power, it was difficult for a young Kano painter to find a job. So Kyosai made a life-changing decision to go back to the world of ukiyo-e, following the footsteps of his first teacher, Kuniyoshi. And he started designing topical and satirical prints. A decade or two ago, it would have been unthinkable for an official Kano artist to make satirical prints or anything with contemporary reference to question the status quo. But by the time Kyosai started his own independent career, the Tokugawa government was losing its influence and power, and social rules were much less strictly followed. Kyosai produced numerous satirical pictures in the 1860s, which was the period leading up to the shogunate regime's collapse. They reflect people's uncertainty and anxiety about political turmoil economic instability, and the foreign presence. He dealt with them with humor and turned the tense, eruptive atmosphere of the time into dynamic, lively, satirical images of, for example, frog battles and monsters parties. Once the new Meiji government was established in 1868, the society experienced unprecedented reform and transformation. After over 260 years of relative isolation, the sudden influx of Western-style culture greatly shocked many Japanese. Kyosai's comic pictures in the 1870s show both the excitement of the new era with modern infrastructure and technologies such as telegraph and trains, but they also display a certain skepticism as he satirized people who blindly followed the new trends and who felt superficially different by putting on a European appearance. It is important to realize that Kyosai never stopped producing serious academic Kano paintings while simultaneously making topical and humorous pictures. And towards the end of the 1860s and 70s, he established his own style by combining the two pictorial modes of Kano-style paintings and humorous pictures with contemporary references. These two modes of image making traditionally had a clear separation and they were not to be mixed. But Kyosai brought in humor and contemporaneity into technically complex paintings, which had been reserved for serious subjects. By doing so, he overcame the conventional divide among pictorial schools and traditional hierarchy among them. Kyosai did this not by denying the academic style or traditional methods, but instead he embraced all the pictorial traditions in Japan and beyond, regardless of class divides or school lineages. He was an ardent student of ancient arts, while he was also an avid practitioner of sketching from life, which was strongly associated with Western methods. And his infinite curiosity was directed also to Western perspective, shading, and anatomical studies. Britain had a strong presence in Japan since the opening of the so-called treaty ports starting in mid-1850s. Japan signed a treaty with Britain in 1857. The relationship was hardly a peaceful or amicable one. In July 1861, the British legation in Edo was attacked by samurai from Mito domain. The following year, another attack was made, killing 2 British soldiers. In 1862, near Yokohama, the British merchant Charles Richardson and his group encountered the procession of Shimazu Hisamitsu, the regent of Satsuma domain. Despite repeated requests, Richardson refused to dismount from his horse to show respect. Subsequently, he was killed by the regent's retainers. This is the so-called Namamugi Incident. Britain demanded Japan to pay £100,000 in compensation, and the Tokugawa government went into prolonged, heated discussions as to how to deal with the demand. This 3 monoprint with Kyosai's depiction of foreigners and samurai was published in the 4th month of 1863, when Japan was facing an impending deadline for the compensation to be paid to Britain. 2 months earlier, British, French, Dutch, and American battleships had entered the port of Yokohama in order to apply pressure on the government. 1 month after the publication of this print, despite the confident depiction of the Japanese side here, the government paid the requested amount to Britain. Britain was asking Satsuma domain a separate sum of £25,000 as well as punishment of those who were involved in Richardson's murder. In the 8th month of that year, they led 7 warships into the Kagoshima Bay. The negotiation did not go well, and Satsuma fired their cannons, which led to the bombardment of Kagoshima by the Royal Navy. This woodblock triptych was published in the same month, but in order to get away with the censorship, Kyosai titled it Repelling of the Mongol Pirate Ships and disguised it as a depiction of the 13th century Mongolian attacks. But the blasting explosion reveals that modern cannons were used in the battle, suggesting that the print refers to the recent event. In the end, in the 10th month, Satsuma domain paid the compensation to Britain, but those who killed Richardson were on the run and they were never punished. In the following year, Britain had another battle against Choshu domain at Shimonoseki Channel in the present-day Yamaguchi prefecture. After these military conflicts, Satsuma and Choshu realized that it would be impossible to drive away these foreign powers by force, and they decided instead to get closer to Britain and purchased arms and spinning machinery from British merchants to overthrow the Tokugawa government. After the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the new Meiji government's policies of introducing Western technologies, systems, and cultures encouraged people's interest in the West. Everything Western and modern became a fad. Reflecting such new interest, there were many introductory educational books written about the world geography, history, and biographies of notable historical figures, as well as fictionary stories taking place outside Japan. In the 1870s, Kyosai illustrated some of these books and included sceneries and figures from Britain. In 1872, he contributed several illustrations in the book The Expert on Western Cookery, depicting European tableware and people cooking and dining. In the notes by the author Kanagaki Robin, it says that the book was based on a translation of a notebook written by an English resident of the foreign settlement in Yokohama to show his Japanese servants how to cook Western meals. In the same year, Kyosai illustrated London Bridge in the 3rd volume of an introductory book on world geography, Roads to the World's Capitals, written by the same author. He also depicted the Scottish inventor James Watt as a young boy discovering a potential use of steam in the 2nd volume of Elementary Book of World Customs, published in 1873. The following year, Kyosai drew the British Museum and the Crystal Palace exhibition in the popular novel Shank's Mare Round the West. He probably referred to such materials as the Illustrated London News, but we don't know what the actual sources were. What we know is that around 1872 and 73, when the artist was working on these book illustrations, he was collecting European and American magazine and newspaper illustrations, making a scrapbook. Kyosai was, like other artists of the time, interested in Western pictorial techniques. He adopted perspective foreshortening, shading, and anatomical studies in his own works. The most important examples of his Western learning in the 1870s are the series of works relating to the Aesop's fables. The first was illustrations for the newly translated Aesop's fables by Watanabe On, published in 1873. 3 Japanese artists, Kyosai, Fujisawa Bainan, and Sakaki Koson, contributed illustrations based on the image plates in the English translation of Aesop's Fables by Thomas James, first published in 1848. The original woodcuts were designed by John Tenniel, who is famous for his illustrations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and two other artists known for animal depictions, Josiah Wood Whymper and the German artist Joseph Wolf. Between 1873 and 1881, Kyosai referred to these Aesop images to create his own works in two print series, illustrations for elementary school textbooks, and a series of paintings. On the right here is a woodblock print depicting the fable of the trumpeter taken prisoner as a scene of the battle in Ueno during the 1868 Boshin War, the last battle which took place in Edo between the Tokugawa shogunate supporters and the allies of the new government. The original image at the bottom is by John Tenniel. On the left, Kyosai reversed the left and right sides of Whymper's picture and painted his own version of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. In the late 1870s and 80s, Kyosai's connection to Britain got more personal as he became acquainted with some foreign residents and visitors in Tokyo. One of the first British people Kyosai met was Charles Workman, who arrived in Japan in 1861 as a correspondent and illustrator for the London Illustrated News. Kyosai parodied his satirical cartoon, The Japan Punch, and featured Mr. Punch in one of his woodblock prints. The surgeon, William Anderson, who Rebecca mentioned, lived in Japan from 1873 to 1880, and his Japanese art collection, which included a large group of Kyosai's works, made the foundation of the British Museum's Japanese collection. Francis Brinkley went to Japan as an officer in the Royal Artillery in 1867. In 1881, he became the chief editor of the English newspaper Japan Weekly Mail, and as a big collector of Japanese art himself, his writings on Japanese art was read widely in Europe and in the US. He became close to Kyosai around 1881 and started to study Japanese painting with him from around 1886. The Australia-born British artist Mortimer Memphis met Kyosai at Brinkley's house in 1887. When Kyosai learned that Memphis was a painter from Britain, he was apparently very eager to hear about British art and asked many questions. He also demonstrated his techniques in front of Memphis. Memphis was a disciple of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who is currently featured in the other exhibition at the Royal Academy. Memphis, on his return to London, told Whistler about Kyosai. Whistler was very interested in every detail of Kyosai's methods, and interestingly, he thought they were very similar to his own. The most important of all for Kyosai was the British architect Josiah Conder. He arrived in Japan in 1877 to teach architecture at the Imperial College of Engineering and became Kyosai's pupil around 1881. Kyosai visited Conder at his house every Saturday to give a lesson. Conder took detailed notes of these lessons and later published a monograph on Kyosai's works and his methods in 1911. Conder was already an accomplished watercolorist, and he made fast progress with Kyosai. In about 2 years, he received the art name Kyo-e, with Kyosai's Kyo and A for Eikoku, meaning Britain, so British Kyosai. They had a profound mutual respect and learned from each other. When they went on sketching trips together, Kyosai is said to have admired Kondo's ability to sketch buildings quickly and accurately in perspective. In his book Kyosai Gadan, Kyosai's account of painting, published in 1887, Kyosai copied anatomical charts which he received from Kondo. William Anderson, who became professor of anatomy at the RA in 1891, identified the original as Julian Faux's The Anatomy of the External Forms of Man, and mentioned Kyosai's anatomical knowledge in his article on the artist, published in the Studio magazine in 1898. Kyosai died from stomach cancer in 1889 at the age of 58. He died at his home in Tokyo, surrounded by his family, close friends, and pupils. Kondo was holding his master's hand as the artist passed away. Arthur Lazenby Liberty, the founder of Liberty's department store, was in Tokyo just before Kyosai died. He couldn't meet Kyosai because the artist was too unwell. And the 24-year-old Rudyard Kipling, who later wrote the Jungle Book and Just So Stories, also arrived in Tokyo too late to meet Kyosai. Kipling recorded his conversation with an art dealer in Yokohama in his diary. Quote, "Who is the best artist in Japan now?" I asked. "He died in Tokyo last Friday, poor fellow, and there is no one to take his place. His name was K, and as a general rule, he could never be persuaded to work unless he was drunk. He did his best pictures when he was drunk. Emu, artists are never drunk." End of quote. And as the dealer told him about Kyosai and showed him a design by the artist, Kipling regretfully said, "I wish I had seen him." After Japan opened up its ports, information about Japan and Japanese objects became much more easily available in Europe and the rest of the world. The 1862 Great London Exposition was really the beginning of Japanism in Britain, which is the fascination with Japanese arts and culture and their impact on Western art. Japan quickly became a trend not only among designers and artists, but also as a fashion among general public, and Japanese items decorated the interior of middle-class houses. By 1880, Japanism had been widespread in Britain. In January 1885, the Japanese native village opened in Hyde Park. It had demonstrations of art and craft making by Japanese artisans and live illustrations of Japanese manners and customs. By the time of its closure in June 1887, over 1 million people had visited the exhibition. Also in 1885, Gilbert and Sullivan's comic opera, The Mikado, opened at the Savoy Theatre, which became enormously successful. Here are the images of the program with Liberty's aunts. Reflecting the great interest in Japanese art and growing private collections, just within 8 months from the end of 1887, 7 exhibitions of Japanese arts were held in London. We see familiar names such as Brinkley, Anderson, and Memphis. Kyosai's works from Anderson's collection were exhibited in two of these exhibitions, at the British Museum and at the Burlington Fine Arts Club. This is a satirical illustrations published in The Punch in 1888, titled The Japanese School at the Royal Academy. It cites an extract from the lecture on Japanese art published in the Times earlier that year. Quote, "Japanese art is the only living art in the world. In comparatively few years, Japan will become the acknowledged center and leader of the fine arts." End of quote. Kyosai was a contemporary artist and was alive and active during the time of Japanism in Europe. He was first introduced to Europe by Promenade Japonaise Tokyo Nikko, published in 1880. The book was written by the French industrialist Émile Guimet, who is the founder of the Guimet Museum in Paris. He traveled in Japan in 1876 with the French artist Félix Régamey, who illustrated the book. They visited Kyosai at his home in Tokyo, and the vivid account of their encounter is featured in this book. It left a strong impression on people with the lively description of the drawing duel between Kyosai and Régamey, competing to make a portrait of each other faster and better. The book was read by many people in Britain too. Memphis also published an account of his personal encounter with Kyosai in the magazine of art in 1888. And this further spread the lively image of this Japanese painter among British readers. So Kyosai was quite well known in the West even during his lifetime. Also, Kyosai's works were brought into Britain and enjoyed by people. William Anderson, as I mentioned earlier, came back from Japan with a group of nearly 70 paintings by Kyosai, and his collection was purchased by the British Museum in 1881. Some of these were exhibited in the 2 exhibitions of Japanese arts held in London in 1888. Yomiuri newspaper reported in 1884 that Kyosai's paintings of crows that Kondo brought to London became so popular that the artist was commissioned to make 100 more to be sent to Britain. To celebrate this worldwide fame, Kyosai made painting seals containing the phrase "flying over all lands" with crow pictograms. You can spot the top one of the 2 here on the works in the exhibition too. Kyosai died in April 1889, and in May, Kondo wrote an extensive and moving obituary in Brinkley's Japan Weekly Mail, using 2.5 pages. An abbreviated version of this was published in London and China Telegraph in June. A month later, in July, another obituary titled "Death of a Great Japanese Artist" was printed in Pall Mall Gazette. This journal had a close connection to Memphis, so he might have had something to do with it. This is what the obituary says. I'm going to read only the beginning and the end. The news reaches us from Japan that Kyosai is dead. Kawanabe Kyōsai, without question the greatest master of his day in all Japan, was born in May 1831. He was an artist of great independence of spirit and early broke away from the conventionalities of his brother artists. He has left a void it is impossible to fill. Many of the best of his works were inspired by sake. Not that he was a drunkard in the ordinary sense. He used the bowl only in the search for Dutch courage, and it is certain that when under its influence, he produced some of his finest and most original work. End of quote. To my surprise, I found out during my research that this obituary, or a shortened version, was reprinted in 28 local newspapers all over Britain in the following 2 weeks. In France, I found 14 obituaries, but they were all published in Paris, except for one of them. In the US, among 10 obituaries I have seen, 7 of them were published in big cities such as San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, and Cleveland. In the case of Britain, where the news spread in local newspapers all over the nation, is rather special. In the UK, people like Anderson, Memphis, Brinkley, and Conder, who knew Kyosai personally, continued to publish important writings about the artist's life and art. And learning from their publications and collections of Kyosai's works, the second generation of writers such as Arthur Morrison, Lawrence Binion at the British Museum, and Edward Strange at the Victoria and Albert Museum kept writing and talking about him. Edward Strange entered Kyosai in the 10th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1902 as the first and the only Japanese person to be featured in this authoritative encyclopedia. Kyosai's name kept appearing in British newspapers until 1930. After that, we would have to wait until 1993 to see him come back in the spotlight when the British Museum held the monographic exhibition of his works titled Demon of Painting, The Art of Kawanabe Kyōsai. Israel Goldman was a major contributor to this exhibition. The 2019 manga exhibition also featured Kyōsai prominently. The current show at the RA introduces Kyōsai to a new generation of art fans, and we're hoping that London will continue to be the center of Kyōsai's studies and appreciation outside Japan. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll get to see the exhibition.